Bishop Hans Martensen stands at the window and looks down at the growing crowd outside the Church of Our Lady in Copenhagen. It is crucial that no one sees him and thinks he was present at the funeral of his former pupil, now scourge of all Christendom, Søren Kierkegaard. The year is 1855. On Friday, November the 16th, Denmark's most venerable newspaper announced, "On the evening of Sunday, the 11th of this month, after an illness of 6 weeks, Dr. Søren Ube Kierkegaard was taken from this earthly life in his 43rd year by a calm death, which hereby is sorrowfully announced on his own behalf of the rest of the family by his brother, Peter Christian Kierkegaard." This calm announcement hides a churning storm. In fact, the newspaper, church, and literary world, as well as the common man, were abuzz with speculation about Kierkegaard. An enigmatic, brilliant loner with more than a whiff of scandal about him, Søren Kierkegaard had long enjoyed the reputation of something of a dangerous man about town. The reading public knew him as the man who produced countless books, some of which were laugh-out-loud funny. Others too dense to understand, and yet others deeply offensive to sophisticated sensibility. Theatre-goers and restaurant patrons knew him as a frequent visitor to every play, opera, and cafe in town. Religious people knew that Søren had been a promising theology student, and that he constantly wrote about Christianity, yet had given up going to church ages ago, and had refused to accept communion on his own deathbed. He even refused to see his own brother, a priest. Romantic ladies and gentlemen knew that Søren had been engaged to a lovely young woman, but that for some mysterious reason it had all been broken off. Gossip mongers and scandal seekers, basically everyone, knew of Kierkegaard from the caricatures and mean-spirited cartoons that the cheap, anonymous magazine The Corsair was always churning out. Playwrights knew that if they were writing a satirical play, to name a character Søren would always get laughs. Young mothers with firstborn sons declined to name their boy Søren for exactly the same reason. The King of Denmark remembered him as the one who occasionally came to visit, and who always made such stimulating conversation. Fishwives, innkeepers, shoeshine boys knew of him as the man who always stopped to talk on his long roundabout walks around town, and who always somehow remembered their names. But friends and foes alike, all the citizens agreed that he was rich. Wasn't he rich? He must be rich. To whom would he leave all his money? So it was that the announcement of the death of Søren Kierkegaard was not going to be the end of the conversation about him by any means. It was only the beginning. The public intellectual Aaron Goldsmith wrote, "He was, without a doubt, one of the greatest intellects Denmark has produced. But he died a timely death because of his most recent activities had begun to gain him precisely the sort of popularity that he could never have harmonized with his personality. The most dangerous part of his actions against the clergy and the official church is now only just beginning, because his fate, undeniably, has something of the martyr about it." Pastor Nikolai Grundtvig, a leading figure in the established Lutheran church and also in Danish politics, had no question about Kierkegaard's potential martyrdom. He preached a sermon on the day of Kierkegaard's burial, giving thanks that one of the icicles hanging from the church roof had now melted and fallen off. Grundtvig said of Kierkegaard, "I do not wonder that he was surprised by death, for as long as the day of the Antichrist has not yet come, those who tinker with the national church will always come to grief, and quickly, just like false messiahs." To be labeled a martyr, a great intellect, and a false messiah all at once is no mean feat. But it wasn't just philosophers and churchmen who had an opinion. Upon hearing of Søren's death, a team of medical research students applied to the hospital to preserve and examine his brain. Such an odd and magnificent mind did not deserve to be buried under the dirt. Their petition was declined. But speculations about the contents of Søren's skull persisted. He was said to suffer from the softness of the brain, wrote one of Søren's committed enemies. Was this responsible for his writings, or were the writings responsible for it? Here was the rub. It was Søren's writings, especially the writings which made up the final stage of his life and career, which lay at the root of all the fuss. This material, now known as the attack upon Christendom, was precisely why Søren's friends and enemies alike agreed that he should not be laid to rest in a traditional manner. And it was because of these writings that his family were desperate that he would. Søren had publicly stated more than once that the comfortable, civilized world of cultural Danish Christendom had done away with Christianity. He had repeatedly denied he was even a Christian, and upon his deathbed he had sent away his ordained brother, refusing to receive communion from a clergyman. But he still needed a funeral, and he needed to be buried somewhere. In later life, Søren's niece Henriette and his nephew Troels would recall observing their uncles and aunts trying to arrange the service. It was a sensitive topic. Søren's public attack on the Christian culture of Denmark was highly embarrassing to the family. As Troels pointed out in his memoirs, a church funeral would be awkward. Everyone knew that the deceased had characterized pastors as liars, deceivers, perjurers, quite literally without exception, not one honest pastor, he wrote. Yet Søren was the brother of a pastor, the son of a publicly minded churchman, the friend of bishops. What is more, despite his later offensive statements, anyone even slightly familiar with Søren's work would see that his was no simplistic attack on all things holy. He never stopped invoking the name of Jesus in all his works, for one thing. And he may have refused communion, but he never renounced Christ. Surely a Christian funeral would be okay, wouldn't it? The way forward was not clear, and the family dithered. As is often the case when no one wants to make a firm decision, a compromise was reached that pleased no one. They would hold the service on a Sunday afternoon, after church, and would not make a big fuss. Brother Peter would deliver the eulogy. Hopefully it would all blow over, and no one would make a big deal. This is not what happened. The celebrated author and contemporary of Kierkegaard, Hans Christian Andersen, sums up the scene well. In a letter to a friend, he wrote, "Søren Kierkegaard was buried last Sunday, following a service at the Church of Our Lady. The parties concerned had done very little. The church pews were closed, and the crowd in the aisles was unusually large. Ladies in red and blue hats were coming and going. Item, a dog with a muzzle. At the graveside itself, there was a scandal. When the whole ceremony was over, out there popped a son of a sister of the deceased. He stepped forward and denounced the fact that he had been buried in this fashion. He declared, this is the point, more or less, that Søren Kierkegaard had resigned from our society, and therefore we ought not to bury him in accordance with our customs. I was not there, but it was said to be unpleasant." With its crowds, colourful hats, dogs and protests, the whole affair had been grossly mishandled. Every eyewitness to the scene comments on the packed building, with funeral tourists describing the enormous crowd present at the service, where the church was filled to bursting. Poor Henrietta, there to grieve for her beloved uncle, was overwhelmed by a gang of gawkers who pushed their way to the church. The tightly packed mass of people surged like an angry sea, she wrote, while a ring of rather unpleasant-looking characters had placed themselves around the small, flower-decked coffin. This group was largely composed of self-declared supporters of Søren, upset that with the funeral, this church was attempting to absorb into its own one of its most outspoken opponents. It looked like this group of toughs was going to carry the day, when suddenly the church door burst open and a smaller group of completely different appearance pushed themselves through the crowd. These were students from the university, also supporters of Kierkegaard, but with a sense of propriety that their comrades lacked. They conquered the space, Henrietta tells us, and their ring replaced the other like a solid wall. The people who were concerned about the church whitewashing Søren's legacy need not have worried. In the end, only 2 clergymen were there. One, the archdeacon of the cathedral, was there because he had to be. He spent the day fussing about with a pained look on his face. The other priest was Peter Kierkegaard, Søren's brother. He delivered the eulogy without directly alluding to the most recent polemics. However, Peter did say that he disagreed with his brother on many points, and that he believed Søren at times had gone too far without realizing it. Peter said he could not thank the gathered mass on behalf of his brother, pointing out that, after all, Søren had always sought solitude instead of being part of a herd. Peter went further. He could not thank the crowd on behalf of the Kierkegaard family either, because he suspected that the crowd was there for mixed motives and wished only to see a spectacle. Peter ended with a prayer that Søren's prodigious efforts would not be misunderstood, and that what was true in them would have a positive effect on the church. After this speech, the spectators flooded from the church towards the cemetery on the outskirts of the city. Nephew Trolls tells us, everywhere teemed with tightly packed crowd which surged over the graves and latticework fences, forward to its common goal. He arrived, breathless, with the rest of the mob at the gravesite. He saw that the freshly dug earth formed a yellow-grey hill, in striking contrast with the green grass which was growing under the iron railing surrounding the plot. This fence had been removed to give access to the grave, and the crowd pushed and shoved over the yellow mud, trampling the grass. Everyone assembled, the archdeacon cleared his throat and began the liturgy of committal. The blessing of God, the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. But what was this? From out of the crowd, a tall, pale man dressed all in black stepped forward and shouted for permission to say a word. In the name of God, one moment, gentlemen, if you will permit me. The archdeacon complained that as the man was not ordained, he was not allowed to speak. But the surging crowd had not come all this way just to see an ordinary man buried in an ordinary way. They shouted the priest down. Let him speak. The man's name was Henrik Lund. He was yet another nephew of the dead man, and he also happened to be a doctor at the hospital where Søren had died. I am bound to him by blood ties, said Henrik, and I am tied to him finally by agreement with his views and opinions, and this, perhaps, is the strongest tie. He, my deceased friend, stands and falls with his writings, but I have not heard them mentioned with a single word. Therefore, let us investigate whether his views are true or not. The crowd stayed silent, expectant. This funeral, said Henrik, is a crime against honesty, a crime reserved for official Christianity to commit. What is this official Christianity then? Asked the doctor, answering his own question with a quote from the book of Revelation. It is the great whore of Babylon, with whom all the kings of the earth have fornicated, the wine of whose whoredom has made drunk all the peoples of the earth. Therefore the deceased has also right, when at the end of his life he so urgently and incisively said what must be said, namely that everyone, by ceasing to participate in the official worship of God as it currently is, will always have one sin fewer, and a great sin, namely the sin of participating in making a fool of God by calling the Christianity of the New Testament what is not the Christianity of the New Testament. Henrik concluded with a flourish. Therefore, both on his behalf and on my own, I protest viewing our presence here as participation in the worship of God, sponsored by official Christianity. I have spoken and freed my spirit. Some of the crowd shouted, "Bravo!" and here and there were voices calling out, "Down with the clergy!" But mostly there was only scattered applause. The crowd stood about, in tense, awkward silence, wondering, what's going to happen next? But nothing did. Søren was laid into the yellow mud, and the shuffling mob melted away. But the presumptuous Dr. Lund did not escape notice. Bishop Martinson heard about this little graveside protest, and the next year Henrik was fined $100 for his illegal speech disrupting the peace. As well as coughing up the cash, Henrik also had to apologize to the archdeacon and the congregation of Our Lady for his egregious assault upon the honor of the nation's most important church. Perhaps even more interesting than his attack on the church was the rumor that Søren was rich. A single man with only one brother and who inherited a fortune from their wealthy merchant family must be rich, mustn't he? Perhaps his house was filled with rooms overflowing with coins. The matter was one of intense speculation and gossip. But when the lawyers finally entered the house, they found a lot of books and a great quantity of paper, but no will and no money. When they inspected his accounts, they found that Søren had spent all his money on buying books and publishing his own manuscripts, and on household expenses, and on the poor. There was nothing left over. It seemed that Søren's life had run out at the same time as his cash. Peter Kierkegaard also entered the house. In a locked drawer of Søren's writing desk, he finally discovered the fabled will of sorts. In fact, it was two wills of sorts. Both letters were addressed to Peter, but neither had Peter as their subject. If Peter had been hoping for some sort of indication of brotherly affection, he was to be sorely disappointed. One letter was dated 4 years previous. It read simply, "The unnamed person, whose name will one day be named, to whom the entirety of my authorial activity is dedicated, is my former fiancée, Mrs. Regine Schlegel." The other undated letter was similarly terse. It left all Søren's possessions to his former fiancée. If Regine refused to accept it for herself, then everything was going to go to her so she could distribute it to the poor as she saw fit. "What I wish to express," wrote Søren, "is that for me the engagement was and is just as binding as a marriage." Søren had left behind another set of instructions, this time regarding his burial site. These papers, dated 1846, listed a set of elaborate details about the placement and decoration of the memorial stone in the family plot. Søren wished to have this poem engraved on his headstone. "In a little while I shall have won. Then the entire battle will be disappear at once. Then I may rest in the halls of roses, and unceasingly speak with my Jesus." Here was a double mystery. Of all the chatter in the newspapers, all the talk of the town, all the wishes of his family, the statements of his friends, and the pronouncement of his enemies, none had settled quite so clearly and simply on the legacy that the man himself wished to leave behind. It would seem that this scourge of Christendom died loving Jesus, and the champion of individuality died loving Regine. Let the people say what they wanted about the meaning and purpose of Søren Kierkegaard, no one could deny that his life, indeed, was a singular one.